So, what Pipes points out is that during all this time, there is a kind of buildup of science because the Muslims took over the Persian. They took over the apparatus of the Persian Empire, or the Sassanid Empire. So they had a way of developing science. They had a way of developing how to run a society. They had a way of taxation. All these things that this ambassador refers to in the report that he sends back to the Sultan. And they were always just winning battles. There's nothing like victory. And so what ends up happening is that from the 1200s, so according to Pipes, from the 1200s until 1789, they essentially are living on their fumes of the science and philosophy that they had developed during the heyday, or during the glorious years of the empire. Now what happens, except for a few things here and there, essentially what happens in the 1790s is you get the beginning of the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. And which is also, again, this is European colonialism. Primarily the British, but also the French, and a little bit the Russians. They start but certainly the British are the biggest culprits in this. They start carving up the nations I would say the British are probably the primary culprits. The French are trying to keep up with the British, but they're not quite as good at it anymore. And then the Russians are probably in third place as far as carving up the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. So in 1790, the Ottomans rule 120 nations. Just to give you a sense of what happens here. By the time you get to 1920, 116 nations are now ruled by some Frankish kingdom. The Franks is a pejorative term for them. So the people they always despise or look down on are now ruling them in 116 of the 120 nations. And maybe it's 114. It's either 114 or 116. I forget the number now. But there's like 4 or 5 nations that are free still by this point. Turkey, I think they set up Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Yemen. That's it. Everything else is a colony of either England or France or maybe Russia. So by the 1840s, the same pattern that began in Judaism in the 1640s emerges within Islam with respect to faith, religion, science, and reason. In other words, the reason God has punished us by dismantling the empire is because we never really fully, honestly implemented the Quran to begin with. When we went to India and we took over India with its 30,000 gods, we were supposed to kill everybody that didn't convert or turn them into slaves. And the people that were advising the provincial governors in India, when they were asked the question, what should we do with all these Indians? The advisors said, well, they're probably monotheistic, so that we wouldn't have to kill them or enslave them. Right? So we hedged our bets. We didn't fully live what we should have lived. Same thing with all the Africans, right? When we went to these African countries in the Animus, we should have either enslaved them or killed them. And then they were part of the slave trade and everything, but they didn't. They didn't like. So the fundamentalists argued. They argued, yeah, we need to, just like the Jews, we need to either use terrorism, use whatever tactics we need to do, we need to engage in order to set up a nation where we can honestly just implement the Quran. And these fundamentalists, they tended to be Sunni as opposed to Shia. And then there was the other ones. The other ones were more the modernist types, or by this time they would call themselves secularists. And they said the same thing. Well, no, the Quran is too brutal, it's too harsh. We need to just embrace modernity, and then we need to retweak the Quran, interpret it as allegorical or mythical, but we need to tweak the Quran to make it more palatable, and just turn Islam into kind of like a cultural identification point. And then that way we can embrace modern science, modern technology. We can embrace all those things that could make Islam great again. because we're losing all these wars to the Europeans because they have science and technology, and they're beating us left and right. There's nothing we can do against their machine guns. And then there was a kind of middle position of, well, no, maybe we should go back to those Islamic philosophers in the Middle Ages, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Averroes, use them as a kind of inspiration for coming up with some sort of new synthesis of faith and religion, science, and reason. And between 19, if you take like 1920 to 1970, by and large, the secularists won out. I mean, as far as ruling societies in Turkey, you had Ataturk in Turkey and his descendants. Many of the kings, Saddam Hussein, the kings of Jordan, these are all the rulers in Egypt. They were all secular rulers, just trying to implement some sort of Islam light in their societies. Pardon?
But fundamentally.
But then no, in the 20s, from the and actually in Iran itself, they established Qam in the 1920s with the idea of that would be a center of religion, science, reason, of trying to come up with some sort of Thomistic, but in the case of Islam, Al-Farabian synthesis, right? Some sort of new synthesis of the divine law and the human law. But so the secularists kind of in the first wave, and what Pipes points out is that it took Judaism 300 years of there being a kind of back and forth between the various factions to kind of for this debate to resolve itself in some sort of definitive way. We're only in the first 150 years of that within Islam at this point. If you want to look at that cycle as telling you anything. So you could say, yeah, from that the secularists, they won the first round as far as governing nations. You can see now in Afghanistan, the Taliban became kind of strong. They're more of a fundamentalist bent. Saddam Hussein, well, he was a CIA creation, but he was a secularist. He was a complete secularist.
Bad
right?
party.
We just had to get rid of him at some point. But the king of Jordan is a secularist, educated at Harvard. I have a friend who was educated at Princeton. He's friends with many of the people in the Saudi royal family. They're really pushing towards secularism. But the other problem is that also in the modern age, which is hard. This is harder to identify back in the 1640s. But you can see in the modern age, there's all these efforts by Western governments to create black operations that look fundamentalist, so as to justify their presence remaining in those societies, right? So you have an added complication, I would argue, that I don't see from 1648 to the present within Judaism. This kind of geopolitical games that are going on. So Pipes' conclusion is that it's going to be much harder for Muslims. He doesn't see how this position could ever prevail, because he would say the same thing about the Torah. It's so brutal. The punishments are just so brutal. It'd be hard for it to prevail. Yes.
What is the QOM?
Qam. Qom is a city in Iran that's known for its learning. It was established, it was kind of, I don't want to say established, it was reinvigorated in the 1920s to be the intellectual heart of Shia Islam.
They're still relevant?
Oh yeah. They have a huge university there. It's where most of the scholars in Iran go to study.
But Iran's run by a fundamentalist government now?
Iran is run by the Council of the Guardians. So the how do we get into this? The thing is just to know where to start.
Yeah.
So the difficulty with Iran is that obviously they're trying to come out of being ruled either by the British or by the Americans. Our CIA's first great coup was led by Kermit Roosevelt in 1953 in Iran. Mossadegh was the leader. Mossadegh was a populist. Mossadegh was trying to get a bigger cut for Iran as far as the share of the profits from the extraction of natural gas and oil. And that during that whole thing, the Americans essentially decided that no, we don't want to deal with Mossadegh. So that's where we orchestrated our first CIA coup to take out a democratically elected ruler and replace him with one of our guys, the Shah. Right?
Now lives in Long Island.
His son now lives in Long Island. Yeah, the CIA has been nurturing him since going back to the 80s to get him back to Iran, get him back on the peacock throne. That's the goal. So the difficulty with Iran is a little bit it's always this tension that goes back to the foundation of Islam between Shia Islam and Sunni Islam. Right, but in the 1970s, and part of what enabled the Iranian government to come to power is that in the 1970s, there was this fellow Qutb who wrote this. He wrote a book. Essentially, it was essentially kind of a Marxist. It was Marxist structure, but how to get the colonial governments out of our societies. But he was writing it especially thinking of Sunni countries. But his book in the 1970s got translated into Farsi and became a bestseller in Iran. And there were a number of Iranians. So the Iranians in the 1920s in Qom, they began this educational project saying we need to come up with some sort of new synthesis of religion and science and reason that will be the foundation of a kind of Shia governmental structure, governmental political structure that will replace the Shah, or will replace whatever Western government is here. In the 1970s, the three factions that came together to oust the Shah of Iran were a faction that followed Qutb, which is a little bit more Sunni fundamentalist, the faction that followed Ayatollah Khomeini, which came out of Qom, and then the third faction was kind of a secularist, French secularist faction. And all revolutions start united and they end in civil war, right? That's just a fact of revolutionary dynamics. So those three factions that ousted the Shah in the immediate years after the ouster of the Shah, they descended into civil war against each other. And this faction won out. But I think one of the ways this faction won out is they put together a government which had like two little things from Plato in it. The idea of a guardian council was from Plato. But also, it had a Shia element in the sense that in Shia Islam, they've been developing, just following Catholicism, they've been developing this teaching of, well, there's a church and there's a state, and there's two laws, but the spiritual law is superior, so they should have predominance. So the guardian council should be made up of ayatollahs, who are like cardinals, right? And they oversee the laws of the country. And they can use reason to interpret the laws, and also to encourage them to change the laws. So it's not as fundamentalist as you would think. Yes?
Do Shia Muslims tend to be more rational modernist, and then Sunni are more fundamentalist?
So the question is, are Shia more rationalist modernist and Sunni more fundamentalist? I would say that there are strong secularist modernist movements in each branch.
Okay.
Though the Shia have a more robust tradition of dealing with reason
Yeah.
in the way that they interpret the law. So this is the vector of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. And it's especially the vector of in these religions, which are a little bit more the religion of law and the book. I think it's much more difficult to come up with some sort of unity of knowledge, unity of the philosophical experience, right? Understanding of the divine law and the human law, and how they relate to each other. And understanding also the place of philosophy. How a philosophy can have a kind of preeminence over science even. Because they don't have as much of a tradition of just developing philosophy. And that's what Pipes says. I mean, that's what Pipes essentially admits in his book, that one difference is that we really don't have any philosophical mechanisms for mediating these conflicts. So that's one thing in which both of them are unlike Christianity. So when we look at conflicts that take place in Western Europe over science, it's much different. I think it's much different, even though oftentimes the people that are writing about it are non-Christians, but it's still much different. So for example, you take the Galileo affair. One of the fundamental problems of the Galileo affair is that Galileo was insisting that it was part of the faith that we reinterpret the Bible according to his science. And when he was found guilty and whatnot, the point that the cardinals were trying, and now there were personality conflicts involved and some misunderstandings, but the point that they were trying to come back after him with was that, look, you can't take a scientific claim and say that scientific claim must be part of the faith. We're not required in the creed to say, I believe the earth is at the center of the universe. Or I believe that the sun is at the center of the universe. I haven't seen that in any creed. Have you? Tell me if I'm wrong. Right? So the whole point is that, and this is actually probably a little bit of a problem of our own age, is that in our own age, going back to from the 1950s to the present, you get a lot of Catholic theologians, Catholic public intellectuals, who essentially are playing a little bit this game of, well, I know that there's this scientist, and this scientist is awesome, and we should just follow whatever this scientist is concluding. What could possibly go wrong? Right? Beginning with like Alfred Kinsey, right? In the 1960s and 70s, all these Catholic theologians were writing as if everything Alfred Kinsey wrote was true. They wrote the guidebooks for seminaries as if everything Alfred Kinsey said was true. In 1972, there was a guidebook that was written, and basically he was just saying everything the scientist says is true. But that's never been the Christian way. That's never been the Catholic way. So anyway, so that's that vector. Are there any questions on that? Islam, Judaism, Christianity. And we had to go into it because it cuts across all of the class, the divisions of the teaching the history of philosophy. But I think once you understand that, it really helps you start to understand some of the philosophers we have to deal with. Yes.
So, in Christianity, what are the tensions, or are we all in unison about faith, reason, and science?
No. So in Christianity, are we all in unison? I would say this, that what you can see in the 1820s, after the French Revolution, there's this very strong naturalist movement. and there's still the naturalist movement is extremely in the 18th century in France, for example, the naturalist movement is completely overtaken everything. Obviously, in England, in the 18th century, it's also taken over everything. In Ireland, there's never been a chance to really develop any kind of intellectual culture. So they have their, Irish drinking songs and Gaelic poetry, and that's about it, right? It's not so bad, but it's just not. It's not a high culture. In Germany, they developed a little bit more of a culture, but in the 1700s, it was mostly naturalistic. Right. So this is the whole point of talking about the three waves of Thomism, is that you almost never get fundamentalists within Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very rarely, very difficult. Can you see any kind of fundamentalism? Usually, like the naturalists will accuse, like nowadays, I was just in Los Angeles, and if you're just a Catholic seminarian who just believes everything the church teaches, well, all the bad guys will call you a rigid fundamentalist. Because the worst thing you can be right now is rigid. Right? Right? But if you're just like, you're rigid, I'm sorry. I've seen it. I've heard you talk. No, but I mean, but usually the naturalists will, so within Catholicism, there's usually some sort of naturalism or scientism that is at war with some sort of Thomism. Usually instead of fundamentalism, what you'll get is mysticism, like the charismatic movement. In the Reformation, you start to get these mystics, like the followers of Thomas à Kempis, or the Jansenists, right? They became more mystical with a spirituality that's not rooted in any sense of being, right? So rather than fundamentalists, you'll get mystics within Catholicism. Mm-hmm. So the primary tension in the last 200 years is the naturalists on the one hand, or the scientists, who've taken over the Catholic universities in this country, for the most part, to make it subservient to the state, right? And to the oligarchs. The Catholic universities are just proxy warriors of the oligarchs, as far as I can tell at this point, except for a few out there, right? And then you'll get. So the primary tension tends to be between the naturalists and the Thomists within Catholicism. With the mystics always, trying to go off and do their own devotions or whatever. Yes?
Can you give a 1-minute explanation of naturalism?
A 1-minute explanation of naturalism? Yes. All human behavior starts with self-interest. And we could derive all of morality and all of our way of understanding the social sciences and all of our way of understanding everything based on self-interest alone.
Adam Smith, basically.
Well, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these are all various forms of naturalism. And also naturalism naturalism requires that the goal of morality or life is not to transform human nature. It's to just manipulate it so that people can act within the context of their self-interest, so as to get good outcomes. And then you just argue over what's a good outcome. So, is that? Yeah, question.
Was Luther a fundamentalist?
I think Luther, so Luther is fundamentalist. I think within Protestantism, you do start to get, I think Luther, he would be more the fundamentalist. I think within...
Like when the Reformation happened, was it the fundamentalists that were driving the Reformation?
Well, Luther was driving the Reformation, and then the
within the Catholic context, was he like more? I mean, the 95 Theses seemed like a more fundamental.
Yeah, I would say because I think nominalism kind of enables the emergence of a kind of fundamentalism within Christianity. Yes.
I just want to clarify, what's the main reason why the church has been better able to integrate faith and reason compared to Islam and Judaism?
So why can the church better integrate faith and reason compared to Islam and Judaism? I think it's because of the first 300 or 400 years of Christianity, that it's growing in Greek culture. And the Greek fathers were trained as rhetoricians and philosophers. And so I think that's one reason. I think a second reason is that the Bible was translated into Greek. And we take the Bible seriously. And when it was translated into Greek, there are, even in the Old Testament, not in the Torah, but there are other books of the Old Testament where you see that there's the emergence of logos, a kind of serious, taking seriously logos, taking seriously reason as part of the faith. Like you can look to the first chapter of Romans and you can see Paul explaining how, by their reason, they should know morality. But the opening chapter of John's Gospel, in the beginning is the Logos. And the Logos is with God, and the Logos is God. That's an extremely rational claim. Right? It's an appeal to reason. So I think in the Bible itself, it's not just, so in other words, I wouldn't want to say it's just the cultural context. But I think because in the Bible itself, in the way Jesus Christ has revealed himself to us, it's as a rational being in that way. And I think the subsequent experience, it's fortuitous, it's an act of divine providence. The Christianity grows in the Roman Empire, where the Greek culture is the preeminent culture of the empire. And so I think that sets the stage of, even Augustine in the City of God. Mm-hmm. There's this one passage in the City of God where Augustine says, I know we live in an advanced age of advanced science and technology, and how we figure those things out, they might condition the way we look at Scripture, because truth is one. But he says, on this question, I think we could go this way or we could go that way. But depending on the science, you would have to look at this passage in Scripture either as more literal, or there is a literal meaning, but maybe with more of an allegorical interpretation, or maybe one way or the other. So already in the beginning of how we understand Scripture, there's even a rational approach to Scripture in the beginning of Christianity as well. Any other questions? Yes.
So what ultimately led, like most Jews, most Muslims, to embrace the modernist approach? Was it just like, well, this works better to win wars, versus like religion, or is it more of a, we just want to fit in with the rest of the world to kind of further economic?
I would say, why would Judaism or Islam tend towards the modernist approach? I think, I know in the case of Judaism, it has to do with how can you defend. It's very difficult to defend the punishments of the Torah as being just. Like someone commits adultery, they should be stoned to death. Right? It's kind of hard. Should we? And if you're going to take that literally, do you mean we should actually take people out and start stoning them? So in a way, it's the fundamentalist position makes it really hard. Mm-hmm. If you're going to be a literal fundamentalist, that's really hard to accept. Like I have this friend that I was telling you about, who's the Samaritan. He can do an exquisite interpretation of the morality of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which conforms point by point with anything that you or I would try to convince somebody to live. Like it's all there in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It's all there, except for the punishments. We don't have those punishments anymore, right? Because the old law has been suppressed. It's been superseded by the new law. Well, not having had a break, I'm tired. So can we just end now?
Yeah.